This is Pinnack News.
This is Pinnack News. We're here with celebrated Dr. Cyril Wecht. He is both a doctor and a lawyer, and he is a forensic pathologist. He's been with the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office for decades and is a great source for information about any autopsy. He's been cited by the press in numerous high-profile cases and by the authorities. Dr. Wecht, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. A pleasure to be with you.
So, Dr. Wecht, I'd like to ask you a few questions about a very high-profile case without delving into the specifics first. But this high-profile case is presented as a suicide by hanging. And there are certain characteristics in any hanging which a medical examiner can tell us about. And I'd like to ask you some questions about hanging in particular, because it's something you've probably encountered quite a bit in your many years as a forensic pathologist.
Yes, I've had many suicides and accidental hangings, and I think a couple of staged homicides, and certainly questionable situations over the years, absolutely.
So describe for our audience the difference between hanging that you might see on a gallows and hanging that you see in a everyday circumstance, because there's some big differences between the two.
Well, hanging from the gallows, as they used to do, execution style, and I think it's still the state of Utah, where I believe the person about to be executed has a choice of being hanged or being shot. But I don't think any other state is still hanging people. But in any event, someone who is hanged, standing then on the gallows, and the trapdoor is released, then there is great force because the weights are attached on his feet to make sure that he comes down. So that velocity produced by the weights hanging from the victim's body, and the drop of several feet, whatever it may be, and the suddenness of it and so on, usually will lead to significant damage internally, specifically some fractures of the cervical vertebrae, and probably of the cartilaginous structures in the neck, the Adam's apple, that's the thyroid cartilage, maybe the hyoid bone, a little U-shaped bone just underneath the mandible, the bottom of the U facing outward. So in a suicidal hanging, depending upon, here again, the height and whether there's any drop, whether there's any velocity, as opposed to a leaning in type hanging, the most recent example that you'll be familiar with is Robin Williams. Robin Williams was kneeling and just leaned into it. I've seen those many times over the years, usually people in prisons that want to hang themselves. So those people are not going to have broken necks. They're not going to have fractured cartilages. Actually, they may have very little damage internally because there's no force, there's no velocity. So there are differences, indeed, between those kinds of situations, and there are differences between manual strangulation and hanging that we look for, certainly, to make sure that someone hasn't been strangled and then strung up to make it appear to be a suicidal hanging.
Would it be safe to say that the main difference between a state execution style hanging and a suicidal hanging would be that in the state style execution, the force is central to the cause of death, whereas in a self-hanging, asphyxiation is typically the mode of death?
Yes, very, very succinctly stated. Yes, I would agree with that. You're right. The person who is hanged on the gallows that drops like that, as they did with the French Revolution,
sure.
Right. They didn't have time to asphyxiate, right? The broken neck might have even, in part, severed the trachea. So you're right. It would be the inability mechanically to have that kind of respiratory passageway as opposed to a slower asphyxiation that can take minutes by someone leaning into the rope or strap or sheet or whatever it is that's attached to a bedpost.
Now, as I've been reading, there's actually two different kinds of self-hangings as well. One is when the feet are touching the ground, as you call it, leaning in, and then another when the feet are not touching the ground. Can you elaborate on the differences between the two?
Well, yes, sure. The one that we've been talking about, where people lean into it, there's really no force, and it's the pressure against the side of the neck, which eventually leads to a state of hypoxia, diminished oxygenation, and then that continues, and the weight of the neck and the decision of the individual to go ahead with it, which I imagine would not be easy, because what you do in your conscious state control your brain. There's a part of your brain that doesn't want to be under your supervision. There's a part of your brain that says, hey, man, I want to stay alive here. If someone then steps off a ladder, then whether there will be internal damage in the neck structures will depend upon the height from which they leap. The top of a step ladder, the top of a banister, a second floor on down, or so on. That's going to make the difference, because then if there's some height, then you get velocity, and you're beginning to simulate the gallows scenario. If, on the other hand, you just step off a rung of a ladder while you will be suspended, your feet will not be touching the ground, you're not going to have had any velocity, so you're not likely to have any real damage internally within the neck.
So what are the characteristics of asphyxiation by hanging that are unique to these cases, the physical signs that you would find in an autopsy of somebody who's hung themselves?
Well, first of all, you start externally.
Down.
Externally, yeah, you got to start externally. What do the markings on the neck show? The furrowing, as we call it, the indentation, the groove, depending upon the knot that is used, or if there is a knot, or so on. And usually, almost always in a hanging, you'll have some upward directionality on either side of the neck. If you think about it, you put something around your neck, and then you lean forward from whatever position, then the posterolateral portions of your neck and the posterior neck, they may be free of any furrow markings. There may be little or no pressure. On the other hand, if you encircle your neck more than once, then you may have some markings there. If you have a homicidal strangulation, then you're not going to have that kind of furrowing. If you're going to have a strangulation of a ligature, somebody comes up to me and ties something around my neck, Godfather Mafia style, then the furrowing is going to be essentially concentric. There's not going to be that upward moving of the furrow mark on either side as you approach the ear level and moving backward. You see what I'm talking about?
Right. So in other words, a strangulation, an intentional strangulation, might be more even looking.
Yes, a ligature strangulation is likely to be more, you're going to put the rope around the neck and you're going to be pulling, and the furrowing is likely to be seen in a more concentric, even like a fashion, somewhat parallel to the ground, so to speak, assuming the person is standing, just to make my point. Okay. Whereas in a hanging, you're going to have the upward movement of the rope attached to the fulcrum, wherever that may be, to the ceiling or some pipe overhead, or whatever the rope's attached to.
Well, what are the other physical outward characteristics of a hanging death by hypoxia? I've heard a lot that it causes, like marks to appear under the skin, swelling in the blood. They call it petechiae.
Well, petechiae, that's a fancy medical word, which means pinpoint hemorrhage. If you take a red pen and come down perpendicularly on white paper, that will be a petechia, plural petechiae. So, yes, in most asphyxial deaths, but not all by any means. In most, asphyxiation from anything will lead to petechiae. These are very tiny capillaries that burst because of two reasons. One, in a ligature or hanging situation, there's an obstruction of the venous return. The blood's not able to come back through the veins, backs up, and causes the tiny vessels to burst. Plus, as the oxygenation is decreased, then the wall of the capillary becomes more permeable and red blood cells leak out. So those are the two causes of petechiae. Now, you see them, as I said, in many asphyxial deaths, but sometimes, paradoxically, you don't see them. You can also get petechiae in perfectly normal situations, particularly people that have bad circulation, congestive heart failure, and so on. So it has nothing to do with trauma. So you got to be very careful one way or another. And I've known pathologists, including forensic pathologists, to make a bad decision based upon the presence or absence of petechiae, which is an unwise thing to do.
Absolutely. It's something that definitely could go both ways. Is age a factor in the presence of petechiae or not?
Well, somewhat, sure. An aged person whose blood vessels have some sclerosis and so on, yes, there's going to be less, flexibility, less suppleness, and so on. But not dramatically so. But certainly there would be some difference if you did a study of 100 people over the age of 70 compared to 100 people, under the age of 50. You might notice some differences. I'm not aware of any such study, but I can speculate that because of age and the changes in the vasculature, there might be a greater or faster propensity for petechiae to form in an older person.
Okay.